All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig deep into the history of a system that shapes the lives of millions of migrant workers in the Persian Gulf, the Kafala system.
So let's just dive right in. When you hear Kafala, your mind probably jumps to the modern oil boom, right? But here's the thing. Its real origins have absolutely nothing to do with oil. It's a story about pearls, dates, and a chapter of British colonial history that's often overlooked. The real story is so much older, and honestly, way more complicated.
To really get to the bottom of the sponsorship system we see today, we've got to rewind the clock way back to the 19th century. This was a time when British power in the Persian Gulf was so total, people literally called the region a British lake.
And you can see how this happened over time. Through this whole series of treaties, supposedly for things like stopping piracy or creating perpetual peace, Britain locked down complete military and political control. They ran international relations, they protected the trade routes, and all of this set the stage for a massive economic shift.
But hang on, before we go any farther, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. The modern Kafala system, it's a labor model where a worker's entire legal status, their visa, the right to even be in the country, is tied directly to their boss, the sponsor, or kafil. Just keep that definition in your head, because we're about to see its original blueprint get drawn up.
Okay, and this is where things get really fascinating. You've got this central contradiction, this huge paradox, sitting right at the heart of Britain's rule. And it's this paradox that completely shaped how labor worked in the region.
See, on one hand, Britain was projecting this image to the world as a great anti-slavery power. They were signing treaties, patrolling the seas, the whole deal. But on the other hand, their business interests were creating this incredible demand for the very thing they claimed to be fighting: slave labor.
Yeah, and this leads us to a myth we've got to bust right now. There's this common idea that the Gulf was just this sleepy economic backwater until British and American companies hit oil in the 1930s. That is just not true.
The truth is, way before oil was even a thought, the Gulf was having this massive economic boom, all thanks to British-backed global trade. I mean, just look at these numbers. Bahraini pearl exports shot up by 800%. American demand for dates literally became a Thanksgiving tradition. By the early 1900s, the Gulf was pumping out half of the world's entire supply of pearls. This was globalization round one for the region.
The whole economy was so wrapped up in this one industry that the ruler of Qatar at the time had this famous quote, "We are all slaves of one master, pearl." It was the engine driving everything.
And that right there perfectly captures the paradox, doesn't it? All this economic activity, all this money being made from Western demand for luxury goods created a colossal, rocketing need for labor. And that need was met by seriously ramping up the slave trade from East Africa. Britain's commercial success was pouring fuel on the fire of its supposed moral mission.
So you've got this huge new labor force. The big question for the British was, how do you manage it all? And this, right here, is where the blueprint for the Kafala system was actually born. Not for oil workers, but for pearl divers.
You have to put yourself in their shoes. For the British, this was a massive headache. Every single year, thousands of foreign pearl divers from Persia, from other Arab states, would pour into Bahrain, which was the big hub for pearling. Trying to police this constantly moving population was a nightmare, especially when you're trying to run an empire on the cheap.
Their answer? Well, they reached for a tool they'd already mastered in places like India, the idea of surety. Put simply, surety just means you make one person legally responsible for what another person does. It was the perfect colonial trick for governing without having to spend a lot of money or get your hands dirty. So here's how they did it, step by step. First, you have the problem: all these mobile workers. Second, the British bring in modern tools of control like passports and visas. But third, and this is the absolute key, they delegate all the enforcement. Instead of policing thousands of divers themselves, they just made the ship captains, the noketa, legally responsible for every single person on their crew. And boom, just like that, the precedent is set. The employer is now liable for the employee. The sponsor-worker relationship is born. And you know, the genius of this system, from their perspective, was that it wasn't some totally alien idea they forced on people. It worked so well because it fit perfectly over the social structure that was already there. The pearling boats already had a super strict hierarchy with the captain at the top. All the British did was formalize that power dynamic with the weight of colonial law. But then, the global pearl market completely tanks in the 1920s and 30s. So you'd think this system of labor control would just fade away, right? Wrong. In fact, it was sitting there,
perfectly ready to be used by the Gulf's next great economic engine, oil.
That model, the one designed for pearl divers in Bahrain, was seen as the perfect tool to handle the massive new wave of migrant workers needed for the oil fields. It was basically just copied and pasted across the entire region by the big new oil companies.
And along with this system of control came this incredibly rigid, colonial-style classification of workers, all based on race and nationality. I mean, just listen to this 1935 letter from the Bahrain Petroleum Company, BAPCO. The language is so telling. Better-class Indians, Europeans, and Americans.
So what you ended up with were these deeply segregated societies. You had the Europeans and Americans at the very top, living in exclusive air-conditioned towns. Then you had different tiers of Asian and Arab workers below them, stuck in temporary barracks, tents, or separate parts of the city. And this segregation was enforced everywhere, from where you lived to which bus you took to work.
And this isn't just ancient history. You can still see the shadow of that employer-centric control in labor laws across the region today. Now, to be fair, things are evolving, and some countries like Qatar have made big changes, like getting rid of the no-objection certificate. But as you can see here, in many places, that core principle is still there. Just look at the rules around changing jobs or holding passports. The power is still very much tilted in favor of the sponsor.
So here's the bottom line. From those old pearling boats in the 1920s, all the way to the skyscrapers being built today, that fundamental colonial principle has stuck around. The state outsources the primary control and responsibility for a migrant worker directly to their employer.
Which leaves all of us with one big, nagging question. If the very architecture of a labor system was designed 100 years ago for cheap colonial control, can it ever really be tweaked or reformed to deliver real justice for workers today? Thanks for joining this explainer.